Thank you so much, Matt. This is the second time Matt is introducing me, and he's so gracious that when he goes on, I'm thinking he's talking about someone else. So thank you. So I'm going to be talking today about biases. So let me start with a question. I guess this is working also, but hey. What are your perceptions about nuclear power? If you think nuclear power is risky, if you feel that it's dangerous, raise your hand. Okay, it's usually the other way. A lot of people usually think it's pretty risky and dangerous. It is. There's risk there, but it's really well managed. So there's risk, but it's not dangerous. And the reason is because of how well it's managed. So you guys have kind of thrown me off my game a little bit because I was thinking a lot of folks are going to think it was pretty dangerous, and I was going to say, no, you're wrong. But here's the thing. So in this industry, in the nuclear power industry, we often have to deal with the perception that nuclear power is, because there's risk, we have to deal with the perception that it's pretty dangerous. However, it's really well managed, and the risks are well managed, and it's actually the safest form of energy if you look at an objective metric of, say, lives lost or health hazards per megawatt generated. So say for the same amount of solar power generated, how many people are affected? How is the environment affected? Compared to the same amount of nuclear power generated and how many people are affected. So interestingly, nuclear power is actually safer than solar panels. And people wonder why, and it's because a lot of people fall and get hurt when they're installing those solar panels. So the point here is that it's when you dig a little deeper and you look at some data, it's always very interesting, some of the things that we find. So are you biased? Are you biased in your decision making? We're going to talk about that. What are some negative effects of bias in whatever industry you're in? I'm going to speak about it from the nuclear industry perspective. And I'm going to share some research that I had worked on at Carnegie Mellon on how we can reduce biases to improve decision making. So what is bias? Now, are you biased? Right? I am biased. We all are, I think, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a heuristic, right? It's a shortcut. Biases are shortcuts that we use to make quick decisions, right? We are not always going to have the luxury of digging into data and exploring and asking questions and making the best decisions. So we have heuristics. We have these shortcuts that we use. So what's the actual definition of bias? It's a human tendency to make systematic errors in judgment or making bad decisions based upon certain thinking, thoughts, and preconceived notions. For biases, we have explicit biases, we have implicit biases. So which do you feel is better? Do you feel that there's a difference in explicit or implicit biases? Which ones do you feel could be more of an issue? Explicit biases or implicit? So explicit biases obviously is when you know it, and the implicit a lot of times is you're unaware of those biases. Is anyone thoughts on? Yes. Right, exactly. You have no clue, and you're so sure you're right, and that can be pretty harmful. So a bit of an eye chart here. I'm not expecting that you can necessarily read this, but we have a lot of different types of cognitive biases. I'm going to talk about two. The anchoring effect and the availability heuristic. And I'm going to talk about some examples from the work that I do in trying to understand nuclear power plant risks. So if this were a risk workshop when I was at Westinghouse and we had a bunch of mechanical engineers, and we're trying to understand what the nuclear power plant risks were. And I asked, well, what are the risks? Everyone would talk about the mechanical engineering risks because they're all mechanical engineers. But a lot of times, the biggest issues we had were not necessarily based on the disciplines that we had in the room. So that's an availability bias. That's knowing, I'm a mechanical engineer, so I think all the problems are mechanical engineering related. But what we found at Westinghouse was a lot of times it was things that were actually outside the company related to supply chain. So that's an availability bias. Anchoring effect. If I asked you what the cost of this microphone is, and I said, the last time I saw it on eBay for $10, and then I asked you, you're going to anchor around $10, but maybe it's $100, right? But that's just the last thing you heard. That's going to affect your estimate of or prediction of the future based on the last piece of information that you heard. So again, a bunch of different types of biases. What are some common causes of these biases? Right? Again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's a heuristic, right? It's a way that it's a shortcut that we take to support decision making, quick decision making, and obviously there's emotions. We're human. There are also individual motivations. There are motivational biases at times where we're trying to influence an outcome, and subconsciously we tend to, pick variables in analysis that would sort of get you towards a particular outcome. So let's talk about the nuclear industry. This is some research that we did where we looked at, so back up a little bit. One of the big challenges that we have in nuclear power plant deployment is the cost. And we historically have had a major issue where if you look at the actual costs of nuclear power plants, which is on your the vertical axis, compared to the estimated cost prior to construction start, we plot all the costs. We find that we always have these overruns where each of these dots represents a right-handed here. Each of these dots represents an actual power plant, and so what this says is at the start of the project, say we thought this plant was going to be 1,000. At the end, it ended up being 2,000, right? And so if all the costs, the actual costs were equal to the plant costs, they'll all be on the diagonal, right? Because 1 will be 1, 5 will be 5, 10 will be 10. But if they're above the line, that shows that for every single plant that we built in the US, we've had these cost overruns. Why is this important, and how is this relevant to what we're talking about? Well, this represents what we thought it was going to cost, and this represents what it actually was. So we always have these overruns, and the estimated costs were at least 3 times, on average, more than what we thought. And a lot of this is because of biases. Also, at the start of the nuclear industry in the US, we thought we were going to see this learning curve where this is what was hypothesized, that the more we build, starting from 1965 to 1980, we would see a cost reduction because we would learn, right? So this was a hypothesized learning curve, which is saying, okay, well, we're going to start at this price, and as we build more every year, by 1980, we'll have about a significant cost reduction. Well, what we had was this, right? So the costs didn't go down; they actually ended up going up, right? And so this just shows how much we totally missed the mark in those projections. So we did a study at Carnegie Mellon trying to understand why this happened. How could we be so off? The red line is what we thought we were going to see, but the blue dots is what actually happened. Why? And so we did a study where we looked at different aspects of the cost estimation and the scheduling. And what we looked at here, what this data shows the estimated cost. So each of these represents a project. So this is the estimated cost of this project and the estimated duration of this project. Estimated cost and estimated duration on the on the horizontal axis. So estimated cost on vertical, estimated duration on horizontal. And this represents all those projects. So this is at the start. And this is what you get at the end. So again, you realized, so at the end of the project, they said, okay, well, what did the project actually cost, and how long did it actually take? There's a lot that this data tells us. One is that there's an inherent relationship that exists between cost and schedule, as one would expect, that was never reflected at this stage, right? So the relationship here, there's really no relationship. You have an R squared of 0.09, which just says what type of correlation are you seeing between your vertical and horizontal axis data? And here you see a strong relationship of 0.43 relative to 0.09. So even if nothing else, this just tells us that there was a relationship that existed between those two sets of data that was not reflected at the planning stage. So the red represents what was achieved, what actually happened. The green circles represents what we thought was going to happen, right? So this is telling us what are some takeaways from this, right? This is telling us that at this stage, we were not communicating. That the folks who were working on cost were not talking to the folks who were working on schedule, okay? Because there was a relationship that existed that they did not reflect. Obviously, there's a magnitude issue here, but there's also a relationship issue here. So if this was, if you still had an R squared of 0.43, that means at least you understood the relationship and you were talking. So this is data that shows us that, again, these experts didn't talk, but it tells us that to reduce biases, that having interdisciplinary teams, having folks who are not just cost experts working on cost is important. Having folks who are not just construction scheduling experts working on scheduling. So bring in, people from different disciplines, and you actually end up getting, at least understanding some of your relationships better. So this goes to show the issue of silos in some of the project planning phases. But there's obviously also the magnitude issue, right? Not only were they not talking, but they also didn't get the numbers, the size of the numbers correctly, and so that's the other issue here. So how do we fix this, right? And I'm going to tie in some concepts related to AI here, right? So how do we base our decisions more on fact than biases? So this is data from a study where we spoke with experts, and we spoke with 10 experts, and we asked them to look at 12 risks that had occurred historically at Westinghouse. And we asked them what their estimate of the probability of that risk occurring again was. So that's what we call I. So that's their initial estimate. So this shows the results from one expert, expert 5. So expert 5, when we asked the initial probability, they said it was 0.1, about 0.1. Then we said, okay, what if we told you how often it had happened in the past? So if we gave you some historical data, how does that influence your estimate? So that expert 5 increased from 0.1 to 0.2. And then we said, okay, what if we told you what other experts thought? And that's the G, that's the group, that's I plus H plus G, and then this expert increases to about 0.5. And so this is what we get when we see, from all the 10 experts, how their estimates change. So expert 1, irrespective of what you tell him, he believes it's 0.7, right? And you see how expert 2 changes, expert 3 changes, expert 4 changes. And what we did here, we could then take some of these data points and plot them. So this is taking all this data, the green spots, and we plot it, and we compare it to what the historical data is. And so this is saying if we do what's called a CDF, don't really worry too much about it. It's basically a cumulative distribution of their estimates. This green line is what the experts think it is as a whole, and this black line is what it really is at the start. So this is comparing how, this is reality, the black line, and this is what our experts think. And another way to visualize that is from a standard deviation standpoint, just in terms of agreement, compared to the historical frequency. And we see how, given them more information, historical information is the red. We see now they're moving closer to the black line. And also we see how the standard deviation is increasing, so is decreasing, so there's more agreement. And then we also see how, giving them the group feedback, we tell them what their peers think, and we see again that there's even closer agreement with the historical frequency. So this is a method that we've used where, especially with this type of visualization in a workshop like this, you can see how you can improve your decision making starting from the green line, which is what the experts generally think just on their own. Again, we provide them with historical information. Well, how often has this issue occurred historically? Then we see how that influences them, and then we see how telling them what their peers think, how that influences them. There's a lot that we get from this type of information. Also, those experts who don't change their position, it's important to talk with them and say why. And those who do change their information, their perspectives, it's important to ask them why they were initially thought, that the values were so different. So there's a lot that you can interrogate from this data and really understand how your experts think and use that to improve these models in the future. So the takeaways here are, again, feedback on historical occurrences improve elicitation by debiasing. It increases agreement. We can see how the standard deviation, which is just how the spread in the range of their opinions, how that is reducing. So we want to have more, the lower the standard deviation, the better. And then we see that those dots that are moving closer to the historical frequency, which we can sort of assume is the sort of right answer. So, major takeaways: yes, you are biased, and so am I. Again, the data shows that diverse and interdisciplinary approaches help to reduce bias. These visual methods to show how you think relative to others is really helpful. And these concepts really transcend industries, so there's nothing here that I've presented that's necessarily specific or unique to the nuclear industry. And this is really one of the tenets of machine learning or AI, which is at a very, very high level, right? It's taking historical data with new observations and making better predictions, right? So, with driverless vehicles, they're constantly taking new data, at every turn they make, how was that turn navigated based on maybe, some issue that occurred, and that information is included in the database, and it's used to navigate that same bend better the next time. And so that's sort of what we're showing here, right? Is how do you take, as a layperson, how do you take historical data, which is what is that's the red curve, right? To make a better decision, which takes you closer to the right answer. And how do you take opinions of your peers, okay, to get an even better and closer answer? So maybe this takes a little bit of the mystery away, out of what AI is also at a very, very high level, and say, how do you apply some of those concepts to your day-to-day regular work as a non-AI expert. And with that, I will take any questions that you may have. This one? So which one was it? This one, okay.
So I get the point of kind of consolidating findings from peers, experts, et cetera, to get closer to an accurate answer. But there's also some pretty extreme differences in the outliers and the red axis between how much the project actually costs, both in the high end and the low end.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the other question I have is there a way of going deeper on some of those individual plants and figuring out if there are things that you should take out of that consolidating approach, whether that be experience of contractors with other plants or maybe the ground, et cetera, et cetera.
Excellent. So this is, for this study, we actually asked that question, which is, we looked at experience. So, oh, okay. Right, so, well, do you want to repeat the question? Okay.
So my question was, when you're looking at this graph of, I guess, green circles and red X's, part of the point in the earlier presentation was that you're consolidating a lot of these approaches to get closer to kind of a historical norm. But when you look at the extremities and the high X's and the low X's in terms of cost, are there other things that you want to measure to basically take out of some of those historical recommendations based on understanding, for example, that red X at the top of the screen? Maybe there were other conditions based on that nuclear plant being built, whether it's the ground or the experience of the contractors or anything else, that you want to basically exclude from any sort of consolidated approach or findings.
Right. So why don't you keep that, and maybe someone else may have a question. So it's an excellent question. So because the message here is we're trying to understand, the relationship just between the estimation errors, right? We're trying to see what type of biases might have existed. But the point is, there may, even if these experts had spoken, you could still have issues that would cause this type of spread, right? So based on a lot of the other factors that could influence cost and schedule overruns. And so we did that, and in that study, we looked at the experience of the builder over time to see if how experience affects these costs, and we found no relationship. So on that one, we looked at cost relative to, it's called reactor construction years, and we essentially had a straight line, right? And we looked at a lot of, we tried to control, and we found no other relationship. So interestingly, one of the big issues has been, and it speaks to this chart, right, this is a learning chart. This is telling us that, the more you build doesn't, help you. We're not learning in the industry, and there are a lot of reasons why we're not learning, right? And so it made sense. But yes, so we tried to eliminate some of those other factors, and based on that, we still felt that this was still a significant takeaway. Of course, there's more to it, right, than just these two factors. But we did try to, remove some of those other factors. It's a really good question.
So my question is, obviously, in this industry, in this type of use case, you're highly risk averse, right? So you want to factor in, I'm thinking, a lot of sensitivities when you plan because you're highly risk averse. Could the contributing factors, just out of curiosity more than anything, related to inflation, what are some key contributing? Because in my experience, often it's the fact that they did not think through risks very effectively.
Yeah.
And I've worked through a number of very large-scale programs, and I feel them kind of sometimes fall apart because they haven't factored in risks.
Right.
Right?
So
risks
it's
around cost and reason. What is that? I'm just out of curiosity.
I'm almost kicking myself for taking some of those slides out because I had slides that spoke to these questions. So we looked at risk identification over time, also to see if, basically we looked at the relationship between risk identification and risk occurrence. And we found exactly what you're saying also, which is the more you identify risks up front, the less they occur, right? The less you identify them up front, the more they occur, which makes a lot of sense. And the data actually showed it because, again, in being a very risk-averse industry, we do a pretty good job of documenting everything we do. So at the start of these projects, they have risk identification workshops, they have risk management programs, and we can see how many risks were identified. And at the end, because the regulator requires us to document everything that goes wrong, we actually can then compare what went wrong to what we thought was going to go wrong. And we saw that relationship also, which is in the projects where they did not identify enough risks up front, they had a lot of risks occurring, right? So you're right, that relationship also factors. Yes.
Can you talk about the relationship of time? Like, did we learn anything? And maybe the worst cases were the old ones, and then the better cases were more recent because we learned some things.
So we looked at, so unfortunately there was no learning. And that's what this kind of shows here, because this is on your horizontal axis, this is time. And each of these are the projects, when the projects were completed, right? And we can see that, so this is what was hypothesized. We thought in 1964 that by 1980, we would be down to $2,000 per kilowatt, okay? The blue dots are the actual costs for the plants that were built. So, this is saying that in 1964, this hypothesized learning curve predicted that all these plants that were built in 1980 would cost $1,000 per kilowatt, but they were upwards of 2,000, so twice the cost. Now, interestingly, after 1980, the costs really went up. And to your question, well, what else was happening in this timeline? Does anyone know what happened in the 1980-ish time frame in the nuclear industry? Yeah. 3 Mile Island, right? So the regulatory requirements, significantly increased. There were delays. And so, but you could even see that it didn't look like we were ever going to hit this hypothesized curve, right? There was a lot of variability in the costs, and because at a minimum, so the hypothesized curve should have had some of these data points below, right? Because this is sort of an average. So this is telling us that this curve was still wrong, even irrespective of TMI, 3 Mile Island. But to answer your question, we explored the question of learning a little bit more. As I'd mentioned, we looked at the effect of building more reactors. So we took a company like Westinghouse or GE, and we said, okay, the more they built, did they actually learn? And we didn't see any relationships. We didn't see any, decline in cost over time. Yes.
Sola, first of all, thank you for a great presentation. That was very enjoyable. For me, the big takeaway was your third bullet where you said, visualizing data helps us to gain alignment. Oh, you don't have to go to it. And presumably, visualizing data helps us to gain alignment where biases can sometimes get in the way. That was my takeaway. So my question for you is this. I noticed that in the case of this example, everyone involved in the study had aligned incentives. So everyone there, for the most part, was automatically on board with the idea of we've got to get this thing done on time and on budget, which I imagined greased the wheels a little bit when you were doing the data visualization. What, if anything, have you learned from this study that you think would be useful for us to understand around how visualization can help people overcome differences when they have misaligned incentives?
Right, it's probably even more important in that case, right? So you're talking about motivational biases, right? So starting with the end in mind, right? We want to get the project completed. And so I think what I would say is we would probably start with a more dispersed distribution where we don't have that alignment, right? So even in this case, oops. We can see that there's still some level of, agreement here. I think if we had less alignment with the end objectives, like so, for instance, if we had a regulator on board where, so these are all folks within the company who want to get it done. The regulator only cares about safety. And they don't care if your project takes 100 years, they just want it to be safe. And so if we brought in some of those experts, or maybe we brought in some interveners also, we would probably start with a more dispersed distribution, right, and less agreement. And we probably will not see this, especially with the group feedback, we probably will not see as much of an alignment, because what this is saying is other experts who I respect see this differently. And I think we would see, what we would see is folks being more rigid, because their perspective is not necessarily influenced by, and in fact, in some cases, they may feel that because the experts are trying to take them in one direction, that maybe they, should stay fixed in their positions, right? So you're right. This, but a lot of that speaks to your selection of experts. You do want people who are informed, right? Because this is not so much about will the plant be built on time. This is saying, will a particular risk occur again? So you do need to have some knowledge of that system, right? But still within that, your knowledge of that system, you do want as much diversity as possible. So if we're talking about a pump, we want a supplier who works on that type of pump. We want an engineer who works on that type of pump. We want a licensing engineer who works on that type of pump, right? And it could be, but also you do want maybe that licensing regulator who knows the issues that not just Westinghouse had, but GE had, and they could bring that to bear, right? So really, I think it's in the understanding and interpretation of this data, and also, like I think I'd mentioned, how you interrogate this data after. What are those interesting questions? Why did a particular expert not shift their position, right? And then having a conversation with them after, and then they say, hey, you know what? It's because I know all the issues that have occurred in other industries that you guys are just missing, right? And so this is not the end of the story, right? It's also saying, how do we, especially those experts who don't change their position. We're saying, we've given you some historical information here. You've chosen to ignore that. You're an expert in this field. What is it that you know? What is going on in the back of your mind that we need to bring to bear here? And that's when it comes out that, hey, yeah, this is a new pump, but we're using some methods here that have not been validated. I have this particular concern. So having those follow-up conversations, especially with those folks who don't shift, is really enlightening. Yes.
So while we're up on this graph in particular, one of the things you have as a bullet point is that group feedback tends to increase agreement, right? So would you ever anticipate situations where, group feedback would take the group further from the reality as opposed to closer? And if so, what are some ways to combat that when it comes to seeking this consensus?
So really, really good question. So if the group feedback ends up, in this case, if the standard deviation went up, right? So there's less agreement. That would be really interesting. And for that to happen, it'll be because I think if you had some of those motivational biases or influences where there's distrust. I don't know these people. They're not, I don't respect them. They're not experts in the field. And so I think we've never seen that happen. But I think, again, you would have to then have those individual conversations that why is it that the opinions of other experts are making you actually change your position in the other direction, right? And so I think it's, like I said, this is not the end of the story. It's how do you interrogate this data, and that would be a really interesting conversation. In that case, you'd almost have to then not just talk with the folks who did not agree, but you'd want to speak with all the experts to really understand, did you have the right folks in the room to start with? More questions? Okay. All right. And with that, thank you.